technical issues, but welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first of our TPR Wheel seminar series, Introduction to the TPR Wheel. You will hear from Andy Nicoll, our OSRL's Principal Preparedness and Response Authority. This seminar will be recorded and will be made available on our website in the technical library. If you have questions for Andy during the presentation, please pop them in the chat function and Andy will come to them at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will hand you over to Andy Nicoll.
Thanks very much, Emma, and good afternoon, good morning, good day to everybody wherever you are. Welcome to this new series of bite-sized webinars built around a concept that's very central to the DNA of OSRL, that of tiered preparedness and response. And maybe you don't not so familiar with the history, but OSRL was set up nearly 40 years ago as a global stockpile and centre of oil spill response capability. And perhaps we didn't realise it at the time, but this was to become a cornerstone of the model of Tier 1, Tier 2 and Tier 3 response. Tier 3 being the global international resources available to the industry in time of need for oil spills. So this afternoon then, it's afternoon for me, we'll just have a look at the origins of the model and how it's changed and how it's evolved more recently. We'll see how the model works. We'll have a quick spin of the wheel to look at the elements of capability that comprise tiered preparedness and response. And I'm calling this the box set because what we're building here is a series of webinars that will look at each element of capability over the next few weeks and months. So we'll build a sort of like a little mini box set, if you like. And then finally, we'll finish up with a summary and some further reading. So the little model at the bottom of the screen there was the original sort of concept, if you like, of tiered response. Tier 1 in the bottom left-hand corner there. And back then in sort of 1980s, right up to 2000, it was the conception of Tier 1 being the local immediate response, which is still true today. And we quite often think of the analogy of a fire situation. If you have a fire in the room that you're sat in, you reach immediately perhaps for the fire extinguisher that may be in the room with you or just around for immediate response there and then. If the fire develops beyond the capability of the fire extinguisher, you need to raise the alarm, you need to get some help. Maybe there's a sprinkler system in the building, or maybe there's some other resources nearby around. And this would be your Tier 2 response, if you like. But perhaps the fire is overwhelming you, overwhelming the building that you're in, and you need external resources from much further away. Perhaps the fire brigade in the local city or town or wherever. And this is your Tier 3 response, coming a little bit longer, but basically the backstop that will ultimately put the fire out. So this is the same concept, the same analogy we use in oil spill, tiered oil spill response. And there's nothing really that's changed in that. So that's the basic model. In 2007, IPECA looked to see how they could refine the model with a bit more granularity. I think at that time, it was recognised that there are other factors that determine the shape of tiered capability. Maybe there's legislation and local rules that prescribe what Tier 1 looks like. Perhaps there is local availability of Tier 3 global resources just around the corner. So you might not have such heavy reliance on the Tier 2 jam in the sandwich, if you like, the piece in between the Tier 1 immediate response and the Tier 3 backstop of global response. But there may be other factors like operational factors, there may be a particularly locally sensitive environment. So these things can shape or dictate how the model is further refined, if you like, to determine the response capability you need at different elements. What we're really going to focus on today is the model post 2016, and after the Macondo incident in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, this really gave the industry an opportunity to revisit all of its good practice, really re-examine the whole business of oil spill preparedness and response, of which tiered preparedness and response, the model, was really front and center of that. I think after Macondo, we realized that we could have a much more granular approach because we've got better communications, better logistics, and just-in-time logistics that enabled us to focus in on specific elements of capability rather than just considering capability as one particular whole. So this was the particular advance, in the last decade, and that evolution is still going on. So we'll look more at that in just a moment. Is tiered preparedness and response? Well, essentially, it's a planning approach that is used to define and structure levels of response capability. And by capability, we often think of equipment. That's the most tangible manifestation of capability. We've got some booms or we've got some skimmers. That could be perceived as capability, but actually it's nothing without trained responders and the logistical support, the additional support needed to make that capability come to life, come to bear. So we use this model to help us define and structure this capability for an escalating response, going beyond the tier 1 of our local immediate response, if we need to build on it to bring in additional local, regional, national response up to the tier 3 level. So the model enables us to escalate the response for a spill of any magnitude. One of the things we did in 2016 in the evolution was to disassociate tiers from the volume of spills. I think we recognized that there was a very bad correlation between the size of a spill and the size of the response required. You could have a small spill in a very sensitive environment that requires quite a significant, perhaps a tier 3 response. Conversely, you could have a large spill away from any sensitive resources where you don't need such an involved response. Maybe the tier 1 is enough. So, and also on that point, when you have a spill, you don't always know how much oil has been spilled. So it's a bit misleading to focus in on the volume of the size of the spill to link it to the tier. It's better to link the tier of the spill to the capability required to deal with that situation. So if we look at the tiers themselves, then, so tier 1, then the cue is, or the clue is immediate, resources required immediately to handle a local spill and or provide an initial response for an escalating response. So in this little model, it's shown as the sort of dark blue sectors close to the hub of the wheel. Tier 2 then is the national or regional bolt-on or build-on resources that are complementary. They come to supplement a tier 1 response. So they don't replace it, they supplement the existing response that's been initiated under tier 1. And then your tier 3, your global resources, are the, for spills that require a substantial additional response capability because the incident is either a very complex one or going to have wide impacts. So the concept of the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, if you like, the fire brigade analogy is still there at the core of this model. But now we've broken it down further into wedges, and each wedge represents a different response capability. And these are subdivided based on the tiers. But so, for example, dispersants, surface application of dispersants may be one element of the capability that you need across the different tiers. So this is basically how the model is built in this sense. So here are the 15 capabilities which represent the full scope of tiered preparedness and response. And in this webinar series, we will take time to explore how the model works for each of the 15 elements. So we'll just take a very quick tour now, as a sort of prequel, if you like, to go round the wheel, looking at the 15 elements that could be conceivably required for any oil spill response from any location. Remember, this is a planning tool that works alongside the risk assessment. So ideally, you already have a risk assessment, so you understand what the likelihood and probability of different scenarios is, and then you can build the capability wheel based on that. And the thing about this wheel, as we go clockwise around it, we'll realise that actually this sort of correlates quite closely with the cone of response. So starting response actions close to the source of the source of the spill, and looking more at the tactics of response in combating the spill on the water, and then we get round into other areas that will become more important later. So if we start at the top of the wheel, probably the first thing we'd want to know in any spill situation is where the oil is, where it's going, what the impacts are likely to be. And this will help us then to determine the scale, the magnitude of the response that's going to be required. So we typically begin with the whole business of surveillance, modelling and visualisation. And you can see in this depiction here, on this particular wheel for this location, we haven't defined where that location is, but we can see that there's quite a heavy emphasis placed on tier 1, which is not surprising. You would expect an operator or a risk facility to have its own immediate access to perhaps models or mechanisms to undertake surveillance of the spill at an early stage. And based on the outset of that, we can then move into the toolbox for working with the oil on the water. And one of the tools we'll look at is offshore surface dispersant application. And maybe if the oil is from a subsea release, we would consider subsea dispersant injection. That won't be for every risk location, and if there is no need for that risk, or if it's not, the risk is not present, then we just grey out that whole element and we don't consider it, and it's removed from the wheel. Another combating tool in the toolbox, very specialised one, is in situ controlled burning. So this would be another consideration, and we look at then to see if we need tiered capability across tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3 for that eventuality, that particular element. And also we look at, to complement that, at sea containment and recovery, using booms and skimmers, if you like, in a collection mode to collect oil at the surface of the sea. Booms and skimmers, of course, can also be used to protect sensitive resources. So here's another element, if you like, that you would need to consider in your tiered construction of the wheel. So depending on the sensitivities, and which hopefully will have been pre-identified in the plan, you can work out what it is you need to provide at immediate level, what's coming from tier 3 resources that you may have contracted or outsourced, and what you need to provide at that green segment, if you like, the tier 2 segment, to fill up the jam in the sandwich, as I call it, in between tier 1 and tier 3. Shoreline and inland assessment, using techniques such as SCAT, shoreline cleanup assessment techniques, is another feature of building capability. So if that's going to be a feature of your response, then we'll go into more detail on that later on in the series, and also the mechanics of shoreline cleanup as well. Inland response is quite a specialist one. It depends where the risk location is. Maybe the source is on land and we need to focus very much on response to oil that's contaminated substrates or got into watercourses, or for inland response, or it may be the oil has come from a marine source onto the land. But in any case, depending on the specific location and geography and risk assessment of the location, we can assess whether we need to develop that element of capability. And then as we go round to the wheel, the elements are perhaps not necessarily all directly coming from, certainly the tier 3 is not all coming from resource providers and contractors, but certainly an important consideration would be oiled wildlife response. Very key area of focus right now, and some of you will be aware that we're doing some work in OSRL to develop a tier 3 service that will dovetail in with the tier 2 and tier 1 elements of managing wildlife and integrating it into the overall picture of response capability. If you are collecting oil at sea or on land, or dealing with whatever wastes are generated from the response, then you need to focus very early on waste management. So again, this becomes an important area of the wheel where we need to build our capability. And I think particularly since Macondo, a key area of focus is stakeholder engagement and communication. And you can see in this example, again, a great store has been placed on tier 1 capability for stakeholder engagement and communication. Again, I think recognizing that the operator has to take control of this. It's not something you can lightly outsource. So certainly for engagement with the local community and with stakeholders, that's an important area of consideration to take into account. Moving around the wheel even further, we get to economic assessment and compensation, looking at how we deal with claims arising from the event, and also what schemes there may be in place to help compensate, either international schemes or local schemes, or industry sort of schemes as well. So that whole wedge also needs to be considered, as does environmental impact assessment and sampling. So this needs to be started at an early stage, and I think this will probably go on long after everyone else, all the other elements have retracted and the response has been concluded. There's still a lot of work to do to assess the environmental impacts. Finally, then, we're back at the top of the wheel, where we get to source control. And it's not to suggest that this is the last consideration. It probably is the first consideration. It's quite a specialised area, and particularly in terms of OSRL, where a lot of focus has been placed on subsea source control using well intervention techniques. Again, this won't apply to every risk situation, but where it does, and this operates typically on a different timescale, this is particularly important. I think if you try and read too much into the sort of the scale of the wheel, sorry, you will be disappointed. If you try and put a quantifiable measurement on the distance between the hub of the wheel and the periphery, it won't really work, because you're looking at different scales. You're looking at litres of dispersant, or meters of boom, or numbers of skimmers. You can't correlate easily the quantifiable measures of tier 1, tier 2 and tier 3. So don't try to read too much into the wheel. My advice would be just to use it as a visual representation of what preparedness looks like for any given risk-bearing location. This can be part of your contingency planning process, and it can also be used to really highlight any gaps that may exist, in the provision at any element of the response capability. Just want to draw your attention to the little yellow label, the fact that each capability in this model is underpinned by a robust management system. And that's not to say specifically it has to be incident command system, but it just means that when you're cascading in resources, your management system also needs to be scalable and also need to be fit for purpose. So having a robust management system at the hub of the wheel is going to oil the wheel, if you like, and give it all, make it all work. So that's a very critical point to just be reminded of, is that at the centre is the management system, whichever has been prescribed or works in the plan. So that's just to whet your appetite, if you like, just to set the scene for the webinars which will follow in this series throughout the rest of the year, as we go into more detail and look at each of the elements of capability and look at how they apply across the different sort of examples, if you like, of how to apply them in a tiered respect. I'd just like to draw your attention before I close on some further reading. There's the IPECA is the natural host. IPECA is the industry body that is dealing with social responsibility and environmental aspects of industry's work across the world throughout the energy transition. And they are the natural host for all of the good practice guides that have been developed by the Joint Industry Project since the Macondo incident. And all of these titles, there are about 24 in the Good Practice Guide series, are co-hosted and co-badged by IOGP, the international oil and gas producers. So you can find many of these publications at their bookstore and on their website as well. In terms of tiered preparedness and response, the Good Practice Guide, the one on the right there, just like to give a nod to the co-authors of that, Lucy Bly and Paul Foley, who together with myself have sailed this journey since 2016, developing the model and putting together the Good Practice Guide. And finally, I'd just like to draw your attention to a paper that was presented in conjunction with Shell at the International Oil Spill Conference last year, which looks at how the model has been applied by Shell and gives some examples using time on the sort of scale, if you like, from the hub to the periphery, so that you can actually then sort of put some sort of measurable scale, if you like, as you can see the escalation of tier 1 built on by tier 2 and added to by tier 3. And just before I finish on IPECA, to mention that the Good Practice Guides, including Tiered Preparedness and Response, are available from the website in a number of languages as well as English, including Spanish, German, French, Italian, Portuguese, and indeed Russian. So I'm actually going to finish there. Hopefully that's enough to whet your appetite. Just draw your attention to the fact that the next webinar in this short series is up in 4 weeks from today. My colleague Simon Blaine will be looking at surveillance, modelling and visualisation, and that's on March the 24th at 2 p.m. in the UK. So Emma, I'm going to stop there and ask you if there's any questions in the chat.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. The first question, is there a legend for the wheel colours, grey, light green, blue, and what do they stand for?
So that's a great question. I think it's just the colour palette that was used at the time. So the dark blue has been used, extensively through all the IPECA and IOGB publications to represent tier 1, and the light blue, or grey if you prefer, is tier 3. So tier 2 is the sort of the jam in the sandwich, as I keep referring to it, the green jam if you like. But no real reason for the colour selection other than the colour palette that was used at the time the publications and the guidance was developed.
Great. And the second question is about the TPR wheel and inland. So how different might the TPR wheel if we're talking about inland spills, so rivers and lakes? There are wedges that can't be considered, i.e. dispersants or in situ burning.
Absolutely, yes. I think we've used a bit of license here just to identify inland as one single wedge, but I think the question's absolutely right. There are many aspects to response inland, so we've just generalized inland in this context of the wheel. I think if inland is not a consideration for this risk location, it's simply ignored, it's greyed out, it doesn't it's not shown on the wheel in any respect. But if inland is the particular risk that the wheel is being used for, then I think there'd have to be a further expansion of the sub-elements, if you like, or the relevant elements. Some of the elements are still relevant, things like wildlife, stakeholder engagement. This will be relevant to any spill. It's probably just the at-sea response ones which are no longer relevant if you're only talking about an onshore risk facility. So you just take the elements that are applicable and develop them as needed, and if they're not, then you don't use them.
Great, thank you. Well, there were 2 questions, there are no more. So I think we can probably wrap up. Thank you, Andy.
Thanks very much, and look forward to seeing or hearing you on the next sessions that follow, specifically on the 24th of March for the next one on surveillance modelling and visualisation. Thanks very much.